This is All India Radio Bangalore and Bhadravati. Satyajit Ray's films were recently screened in Bangalore. Mr. Ray, who was in Bangalore in this connection, recorded an interview in our studios. We now bring you the first part of the interview recorded with this renowned filmmaker. In this, he speaks about his initiation into filmmaking. Sri M. A. Parthasathi is the interviewer.
I think our listeners would be interested in a quick glimpse of the background of the man I'm talking to. Mr. Satyajit Ray is indeed the most outstanding filmmaker of the world today, in my opinion. His distinction in cinema began with his immortal Pather Panchali in 1952 and continues to bring him laurels greater and greater over the years, even today. He has won almost every important award in the world. The President's Gold Medal 1955, the Cannes Film Festival Award, the Selznick Award, the Golden Lion at Venice, and so forth. India has honored him with the Padma Shri in 1958 and the Padma Bhushan in 1965. More recently, apart from winning awards at the Berlin International Film Festival, Mr. Ray has won the Raymond Magsaysay Award and the National Film Award of India in 1968. How does it feel, Satyajit, to have achieved so much in such a short time?
Well, it's most gratifying, really. When we started making films way back in 1952, actually it was in 52 that I started Pather Panchali. I finished it in 55. I had no thought of awards, of course. But then they just started coming. I suppose I've been very lucky.
Well, I don't know that it's all luck. I see that in your films there is such passion for the subject, such intimacy with the characters, such a new trail has been blazed by you that I'm not one bit surprised. I think every award that you have won is wholly deserved.
Well, thank you very much, Sarthi. I'm indeed very kind of you to say that.
I know that most people know the general pattern of your spectacular film career. Perhaps I should ask you to give us a glimpse of your personal life. What made you first get interested in cinema, in filmmaking?
Well, I have to go back pretty far. You see, even in my school days, I had already, I think around my final years at school, I had already become a film fan, a kind of rabid film goer. And but it was mainly American films in those days. But we used to go and see every sort of Hollywood, anything exciting that came out from Hollywood. But then that was only a kind of film goer's interest, nothing more than that. And then I went to, after my college, I went to Shantiniketan, where I was as far away from films as imaginable, because there was not a cinema within miles of the place. But I was studying painting there at Kala Bhavan under Nandalal Bose. But at that time, I was also reading books which belonged to the library there. And strangely enough, the library in Kala Bhavan contained some of the more important books on film theory, like Pudovkin and Eisenstein and Paul Rotha. At that time, there were barely 6 or 7 books on the cinema anyway in the English language,
but
not
still
like
at
now.
The Kala Bhavan
in Kala Bhavan they had those film books, extraordinary.
That speaks very highly of the place.
Yes, and I was able to read them, and I think that was the point where my interest took a slightly different form. I came back and I joined this advertising agency in 43, and by 47 I had founded, along with a few friends, the first film society in Calcutta, 47. And then the idea struck me that it would be, by that time of course I had become the art director of this agency, and I was drawing a fairly decent salary for those days. But I had been bitten by the film bug already, and I was looking at films with a different eye already, trying to study the technique, seeing an interesting film maybe 4 or 5 times, even taking notes in the dark, like that. And then the Film Society, and then the arrival of Renoir in 1949, I think, when he first came to look around for locations. I had seen some of his American films, not his French films. I went and saw him, and by that time, it was a combination of circumstances, really. I had read this book by Bibhuti Banerjee called Pather Panchali, and there was a new edition, and I was asked to do the illustrations. So I drew the illustrations for the new edition, and then I fell in love with the story and with the characters, and began to think of the book in terms of the cinema. And I had a chance to tell Renoir that I had film ambitions, and someday I hope to make a film. And he said, "What film?" And I said, "Well, this film." You know, I gave him the story. An outline. He said, "Marvelous, do it. It'll make a wonderful film." But that was still 1950. And then my office, my firm, sent me out to England to their head office. And I was in London for about 6 months. And in those 6 months I saw about 95 or 96 films, lapping up everything. You know, the first film I saw was Bicycle Thieves, along with the Marx Brothers, The Night at the Opera. It was a double bill,
yes, I see.
Extraordinary double bill. Anyway, then I thought that if they can make Bicycle Thieves with non-actors on location, why can't I make Pathet Panchali the same way?
Absolutely, absolutely.
So I wrote the treatment on the way back on the boat. But then, of course, for 1 year in Calcutta, I was trying to sell the idea to somebody. I went to every producer in town. I read my script through, 2 hours acting it out, showing the sketches and everything, but everybody turned it down. Then we started with our own money, and we ran out of funds, and when we had no money for a year, then somebody suggested the West Bengal government says, "Why don't you?" And we managed to pull some strings here and there, and they finally took it up. They became producers. They put up the rest of the money, and in installments, mind you, and so it took us more than a year, even after the government had taken over.
I see.
And I still had my advertising job, so we were shooting mainly on weekends.
I see.
And
I
the
didn't know
puja
this.
holidays. Oh yes, I couldn't give up my job at that point because my future was so uncertain. My mother wouldn't let me give it up anyway. So then Pathet Panchali eventually was finished, and it found a theatre, and it played, and of course you know the success. And then I gave up my job.
Magnificent, I tell you. Magnificent. You mentioned...
And then I became a filmmaker.
Well, you were, I think, already a filmmaker. You arrived, shall we say.
Anyway.
You mentioned Jean Renoir.
Uh-huh.
Well, at the time that you communicated with him, a little thereafter, I became one of his disciples, and I worked on this film, The River.
Yes, I know about that.
And he mentioned this marvelous creative artist that he had met and the idea that he had, and one of these days he must make it. Have you been seeing Renoir recently too?
I have seen him off and on. Once in Paris I went to his house in Avenue Frochot. He was being interviewed by Truffaut at that time, who was still a journalist. And then second time I met him again in Paris, and he took me around in his very small car. I don't remember what make of car it was, but I could barely get in. Anyway, he gave me lunch, and he took me to his Pathé studio where he was editing Le Déjeuner sur l'herbe.
Yeah.
Remember that?
Yes.
Lunch on the grass.
Yes, Lunch on the Grass.
And then in Hollywood. That was quite an occasion when McEldowney gave a big party for my sake, and he invited Renoir and all the celebrities. I mean, I met Polanski and his wife, who was sadly murdered. Remember that story?
Yes, Sharon, yes.
And then we had a screening of The River,
Mhm.
and Renoir and I were asked on the stage, and we made brief conversation,
Marvelous.
thinking
marvelous.
back on old times.
He is still a very
Extraordinary man. He is a
sensitive-
very great man, and I consider him as one of my mentors, shall we say.
That's warming to hear. Who do you think you travel so much and you have occasion to come in contact with so much of filmdom in the world? Who would you name among the people that are outstanding today? I mean, not necessarily today alone, outstanding until today.
Well, you see, since I learnt my craft from the American movies, I can't leave them out. I mean, they have to be the first names that I mention. Directors like Ford and Wyler and Capra and Zinnemann and Huston and Wilder and George Stevens, like that. They were great craftsmen, and some of them were artists too.
What about Elia Kazan?
Kazan came later, you
Yes,
see. Kazan
yes.
came when I had already started my film society. But these were the people from whom I learned my craft. Kazan, and then, of course, then you have to mention many names, like
Stanley
present-day
Kubrick,
Kubrick.
Yes, Kubrick.
Kubrick is marvelous. But then you have those European directors, too. De Sica was a great influence to begin with. But De Sica is no longer what he used to be. He's
No.
turned commercial. But you have Fellini, a marvelous director, who meant a lot to me, and then Bergman, who has been a consistent source of inspiration. He's a marvelous artist, and he has the enviable freedom and the enviable cast of actors. He's
Yes,
incredible.
yes, you're so right.
He's
So right.
like a musician who has a set of great instrumentalists at his disposal, so that he can write any work for them and they interpret it perfectly. But among the new ones, the more comparatively recent ones, you have Truffaut, who's remarkable. Godard, for a time, seemed a tremendously important figure, but now he's turned a politician more than a director, and that I regret. Well, there are many like that.
Yes,
Some
yes.
of the Czechs, some of the Poles, Vaida, Polanski himself is a fine director.
Yes, he's an
Some of
excellent
the
director.
British ones who are slightly erratic, but they have done good work, like Tony Richardson and Lindsay Anderson, Carol Dries. But you know, a filmmaker is not necessarily influenced by other filmmakers, because film is a medium where you have all these arts forms converging. So when I used to mention names of filmmakers in the past, this question was often asked to me by journalists, who influenced you? And I would name the names that they would expect me to name to make them happy.
You're so right.
But now I have other names, like I'm influenced by Kalidas's plays, I'm influenced by the paintings of Ajanta, I'm influenced by Nandalal Bose, and I'm influenced by the books I base my films on. I didn't know anything about the village in Bengal when I made Pather Panchali. It was Banerjee's book which told me about the village, and the film derived from the book.
You see, the whole world is your oyster now.
Yes, and
you
of
can
course,
absorb it.
my interest in Western music, I think knowledge of music is basic for a filmmaker. A sense of a pattern in time is absolutely basic for a filmmaker. I think my knowledge of Western music has helped me greatly. Indian music, of course, too, but then Indian music improvised. We have not that conception of a rigid, inflexible form existing in time, pattern, whereas in Western music you have a composition, which is performed in the 18th century in the same way as it's performed in the 20th century, which is slightly different.
You talked of music. Renoir and I had some, shall we say, warm moments which became a little more heated than warm on the subject of the music of the river.
Yes.
I did the score for it using completely Indian classical music.
Yes.
And we had to interject a little bit of Schumann, again classical, for a certain mood. Here, I had to choose between a raga that was supposed to indicate a certain mood.
You stuck to mainly Carnatic music, I
Carnatic.
think. Yes.
Carnatic, but a little whiff of Bengal, because really
Yes.
the theme was the river in Bengal, and we used quite naturally Bengal.
Yes.
But we took some liberties with an all India classical music
Yes, yes.
instead of a Bengal classical music. And we took that film from pillar to post in the US in semi-edited form to get a thing called audience reaction, the lowest common denominator. We had to find the line of least resistance among US audiences. So we took it from place to place and said, what do you think? And most people began to write during the early days of the sneak previews, what is the noise about? Which is the way they interpreted classical Indian music.
They won't say that anymore, because
Not
now
anymore.
they know West Indian music.
You have done it.
No, well, Ravi Shankar, I think, is very largely responsible.
Well-
Ravi Shankar, let's say, via Pather Panchali.
Yes, via
Because
Pather
in the
Panchali.
early days, Ravi Shankar, whenever he sat on the concert platform, they said, play something from Pather Panchali.
Exactly. And the combination of Ravi Shankar and Satyajit Ray has made the visual and the audio
Yes.
arrive in America, the Indian visual and the audio in classical form, and that is really marvelous for the future. I cannot tell you how many important Indian films I took to other parts of the world, studied the local production, attempted to speak to the local people to say, will you take this? This was in the early 50s, shall we
Yes.
say, the
Yes.
pre-Pather Panchali era. So I think, considering that we didn't do a thing at all before you arrived, the Indian film industry owes you much more than it has accepted as owing to you.
Well, thank you very much.
You are listening to the famous filmmaker Sri Satyajit Ray, interviewed by Sri M.A. Parthasarathi. The second part of the interview about Satyajit Ray, his art and craft as a filmmaker, will be broadcast tomorrow, 8th of January at 8:25 p.m. This broadcast came to you from All India Radio Bangalore and Bhadravati.